Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, Left Sports Radio, a weekly news hour highlighting the various intersections overlapping the world of sports, politics, and radical activism. We are available for broadcast by any Pacific Radio member network station, college and community radio stations, and as many low-power FM stations that would like to take us, as many already are. If you can't listen live, we're also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. Audio streams of our podcast and video editions are also available at our website, notanothersportshow.podbean.com, or at tinyurl.com/NASRadioVideo. To contact the show, you can use @NASRadioSports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, or use the hashtag NASRadio to get in contact with us, and we are always looking for feedback as we get into a number of major issues happening in the sports world. Well, last week we had the anti-Olympic group from Tokyo, Hangoren no Kai, on the broadcast with us, and it became a huge show. It's one of our most downloaded broadcasts ever, and so we did spend a lion's share of the time talking with them on a number of key issues related to the Olympics, and later on in the broadcast we'll also be talking about the Olympics. But we did want to spend some time getting into a little bit of an update of a story we briefly talked about last week, but one that we really need to spend some more time on talking about, and that is the story involving the police of Palm Beach Gardens and Venus Williams, who just got second place at Wimbledon. The tournament, of course, got a lot of press, and what also got a lot of press was Venus Williams allegedly, according to police, being, quote, at fault for violating the right-of-way, close quote, and causing a traffic accident that caused the death of another person. And the police were investigating this issue, and even though the investigation was not done, they publicly came forward and said that she was, quote, at fault for violating the right-of-way, close quote, and responsible for this accident. Now, the investigation wasn't done. The investigation was not finished. They had not finished gathering all the evidence, yet they saw fit to put this statement out there. They saw fit to put this statement out publicly for public consumption. And she was even asked about it at Wimbledon, and she broke down during the question and answer session about it and had to take a few moments and then come back and finish answering questions about it, as well as a number of other topics at the Wimbledon presser. Well, video was procured and released by TMZ. Yes, the kind of smarmy group TMZ that gets their hands on all sorts of stuff and publicizes it involving celebrities. Well, they got their hands on the video and they have publicized it. They've put it out there for public consumption. And the police have now said that based on the video evidence, that she's not at fault and that she was legally in the intersection before the crash, that she legally could have been there and was not at fault. Yet, the publicity for that statement was not nearly anywhere in the same level of publicity that was given to the initial statements saying that she was at fault, and the initial police pronouncements putting that out there, that she was at fault for violating the right-of-way and alleging that she caused this death in the traffic accident. That the statement was not nearly as prominently put out saying that she wasn't at fault. Even the ESPN headline didn't mention that. You had to read it in the story. Yet they had, initially when the story first broke, that she was at fault for violating the right-of-way, and highlighting that with the headline of the story. In the subsequent headlines, very few people actually started the headlines with, she's actually not at fault, and the police had to back themselves into a corner and eventually say that she wasn't actually at fault. The Palm Beach Gardens police spokesperson, Major Paul Rogers, said that the video caused them to reevaluate their conclusion, but that the investigation is still underway and that a final determination was not done. Well, if a final determination was not done and the investigation still was underway, why did you make an initial statement in the first place? Why did you initially say that Venus Williams was responsible for the accident and said that she was, quote, at fault, close quote, if the investigation wasn't totally done. I mean, if we're to believe the investigation wasn't totally done, then why make the statement in the first place? And then the video evidence was not procured by the police. The video evidence was procured by TMZ, a media outlet. A media outlet was the ones that got their hands on the video. The police didn't get their hands on this video. Easily accessible video. Video that people given that area, hey, there's cameras in this area. Let's go check those cameras and see if it caught the accident. Somehow that didn't cross any of their minds before they went out and started making statements that Venus was, quote, at fault, close quote. Somehow we had to rely on TMZ to bring this out. Why did this not stop the police earlier from saying she was at fault? You know, they're now couching themselves in, well, it's still an open investigation and there's still investigation to be done and it's still underway. And we still haven't determined anything. Yet that didn't stop them the first time when they put a statement out there saying Venus was at fault. It didn't stop them at all. And to not get the video evidence. At best, it's incompetence. At best, it's incompetence. And at worst, it's actively trying not to find the evidence. At best, it's incompetence. At best, in this. And are we going to see any kind of accountability or responsibility with this police report and the police saying that she was at fault when all the facts weren't actually in, the investigation wasn't done? Are we going to see any kind of accountability for that? Of somebody losing a job, somebody getting punished, somebody getting nailed for the trauma that Venus has had to deal with, being told she was at fault for causing the death of another person? Are we going to see any kind of responsibility or accountability from the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department for that? Are we going to see any kind of real accountability? Are we going to see any real responsibility being taken there? Are we going to see any of that? Well, it's not really likely, because we have a system in this country, an institutionalized system, institutionalized structures like policing, where we tend to consistently, almost without a doubt, give benefit of the doubt to the police, despite video evidence to the otherwise. We even want to believe that anything they do is somehow acceptable. We always want to believe that whatever they've done is somehow acceptable. That the narrative about how they're going to war with the general public, essentially, and seeing us as the enemy when they go out, that we're constantly willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, even when the video evidence shows the opposite, even when testimony shows the opposite, even when it's very clear. We're constantly wanting to give them the benefit of the doubt, largely by and large is because we've associated the police with frames of whiteness. And with those frames of whiteness comes the getting the benefit of the doubt. They didn't totally mean it. They're probably telling the truth. That those kinds of frames about being white are typically going to be applied to structures like the police. Meanwhile, we have really negative frames about people of color, constantly thinking they're guilty, constantly thinking they're criminals, constantly thinking they're problematic. And these kinds of frames of institutional whiteness and institutional blackness and anti-black racism largely portray how people function in this society, even to the level where you might not even be conscious about it. And there have been multiple studies done showing that, from little children, asking them, who are the good kids and who are the bad kids, using these pictures and little dolls, and the kids always pointing to the whiter of the dolls or the whiter of the children in the pictures compared to the blacker of the dolls or the blacker in the pictures. That this is an institutionalized thing. This is an ingrained thing that's been taught. It's been reinforced quite systematically and quite systemically And once you start seeing it, then you can start to try to dismantle it and address it and start pulling it apart. I mean, this is another prominent case involving issues with problematic policing involving people of color. And as we've talked about in this show, money does not make them totally immune to all racism. Certainly, it inures them to certain aspects of racism that people of color, particularly poor people of color, encounter on a much more regular basis. But it does not inure them entirely to the realities of policing and the racist institutional structures of institutionalized racism. It doesn't make them immune to this. It doesn't keep them from having to suffer some of these issues. And we're seeing a lot of press. We're seeing a lot of publicity about this case. We're seeing it about a lot of other cases. But how many more are happening and we're not talking about them? How many more are happening and we're not hearing about them? We're hearing about the Venus Williams case or the Thabo Sefolosha case or the James Blake case because these people are very prominent and they have money and therefore they're getting a lot of public attention. How many more of these cases are happening and we're simply not seeing them? How many more of these kinds of cases are happening and we're not paying attention to them because the people being impacted by them don't have the social capital or the political capital or the financial capital to put their names out there publicly and prominently and start reinforcing this as a public discussion? How many more of these cases are happening and we're not really seeing, we're not totally privy to be paying attention to, they're not becoming major public statements and public discussion topics? And whether this is the case of Thabo Sefolosha, who the NYPD broke his ankle, or James Blake, the former tennis star who was tackled by a police officer in a case of mistaken identity and roughed up, or this case involving Venus Williams, or 12-year-old Tamir Rice, who was shot by the police, or Philando Castile, or Laquan McDonald in Chicago. How many more cases? How many more does it take before we can get past the isolated incidents, or the it's just a few bad apples, or it's only a few officers that are doing this, and get to the real recognition that this is an institutionally problematic issue? This is something institutionally that we need to discuss, of how we root this kind of culture out, how we dismantle this kind of culture and take it down. How do we get rid of this kind of culture and smash it so we don't have these incidences or have all these explanations as to things that can explain it away, of it's only a few bad apples, or it's only a few isolated incidents, or it's only a few, really negative cops. Well, if these kinds of things have happened and the other cops don't say anything about it, or the other cops aren't public in their condemnation of saying, this makes me look bad, then that says more about them than it does anything else. That if they're willing to be silent in the face of this, then I really question their goodness. I really question the morality then of it's just a few bad apples. Because if you knowingly see things that you have a visible problem with and you're being represented wrongly, why would you remain silent about that? Why would you remain silent about that? And All Lives Matter has been this reflexive push, and we've seen this and we've talked about this on the show before. All Lives Matter, that whole mantra, has been a reflexive push that only came into the public sphere after police killings in communities of color and the Black Lives Matter protests started. That this was not anything that was actually meaningful or substantive to push that out there. It was simply a way to argue against the premises of Black Lives Matter, which is the lack of accountability for police when they kill people in communities of color, largely. When they kill people in communities of color, there very, very rarely any actual real accountability happening for those officers. And it's really interesting to see the people who parrot the All Lives Matter ideology that they keep putting that out there, the all lives matter, all lives matter, all lives matter. But they never stop finding any kind of excuse, any kind of rationale, or any kind of reason that would justify the police killing of an unarmed black man or a woman. That somehow it's got to be acceptable. That, well, we don't know what was on the tape beforehand, or we don't know what was on the tape afterward, or we don't know what led up to this, or if he hadn't been breaking the law, then he would have been alive today. And it's really, really interesting when you start to see these kinds of things of all lives matter, yet they're trying to find justifications for, why these killings are okay, why these killings are not wrong, why these killings aren't just completely immoral and need to be dealt with, trying to find some kind of justification, excuse, or rationale to make it acceptable that these sort of things happened. But all lives matter. And, to tie into that, recently on social media, there's been the viral video of the unnamed police officer getting mad that people are protesting every thug, and he uses a bunch of racially coded words because, of course, he's talking about black people being shot by police, but that a number of these celebrities and protesters aren't mentioning the recent NYPD officer who was killed. And he's like, we see you, we're going to get, we see you, you guys are hypocrites, and, all that kind of stuff. Well, the issue is with the protests, it's not necessarily that, someone has died. And that's tragic and that's bad that someone has died. But the issue is we have no doubt that the killer is going to be charged by the district attorney. We have no doubt that that's going to happen. 100% certainty that killer is going to be charged. We have no doubt that's going to happen. We also have no doubt that the jury in this system is very likely to find them guilty and give them a very harsh consequence for the crime that they committed. We have no doubts that's going to happen. The reason there are so many protests is because there's plenty of wonder and there's plenty of doubt about whether an officer is going to be charged when they kill an unarmed person, even when it's on videotape. It's not necessarily just about the death. It's about the lack of accountability, the lack of responsibility, and the impunity that some actors have on behalf of the state when they kill, and the accountability that's immediately given to private individuals when they engage in a violent act of killing someone. That's the issue here. The issue is that there's plenty of doubt, there's plenty of uncertainty of whether or not an officer is even going to be charged, let alone found guilty when they kill an unarmed person. That's the issue here. It's not just that someone died. The issue is that there is plenty of doubt, there's plenty of uncertainty here. The issue is not just that someone got killed. The issue is the lack of accountability, the lack of responsibility, the impunity for some compared to others. That's the issue. That's the problem. And we see that again with this kind of police statement of Venus Williams being at fault for the traffic accident that killed someone, then announcing, well, she's technically not at fault because the media got their hands on some video and showed us that she wasn't at fault. But actually, we're still not finished investigating, but yet that somehow didn't stop them from making the statement before, because we have a profoundly, profoundly institutionally racist system. And looking at the manifestations of that, we need to stop seeing these things as isolated instances, stop trying to find justifications to explain it away, stop trying to find explanations that go into a certain facet to try to just say, well, it's not so bad, and recognize it for what it is and start to make the dismantling happen. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media. We've just been discussing Venus Williams and the recent updates from the police finding her not to have been at fault at the accident that killed a person. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, we'll be analyzing why Marlins owner Jeffrey Loria continues to be one of the worst, the NBA's Detroit Pistons owner finding his way into that running, as well as some international Olympic and track news. And so we are going to get right into it, and we're going to talk some baseball news. In baseball news this week, the Miami Marlins owner Jeffrey Loria is back in the news. Yes, this owner has allegedly engaged in wage theft, which he settled in 2014, where the Miami Marlins agreed to pay $288,290 in back wages to team employees, including clubhouse and office staff. The 23 clubhouse workers who provided services to team players, such as cleaning and preparing the locker rooms for games, were paid $50 a day, but they worked as many as 11 hours on those days and were not properly paid minimum wage or overtime. And so he had to pay nearly $290,000 in back pay to those team employees. Yes, this owner is the same owner who got the team involved in a stadium boondoggle for getting the city of Miami and Miami-Dade County to pay for a stadium with 75% of the $634 million park coming at the public's end of the cost structure. And the stadium is now, when you add in all the costs, all the bills, it's easily going to be over $1 billion in total cost that he got the city and the county to be on the hook for 3/4 of the public financing of that. Yes, this is also the same owner who was investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission over his crying poor, necessitating the huge public expenditure for his brand new stadium. But leaked documents that were sent to the website Deadspin showed that he was actually profiting a lot more than the financials that he had released showed. That he was crying poor, yet his own financials showed him to be cutting a much larger profit than he had alleged that he was actually making. So he was investigated by the SEC. Yes, this is the same owner who engaged in a fire sale of team talent in 2013 after getting his stadium and giving out massive contracts to a number of players to all bring them in to get a number of people to sign up for season tickets. And once it was clear the team wasn't performing very well and that he had a lot of people on the hook for a lot of money already and he had gotten what he wanted, well, he engaged in a fire sale and sent most of the talent away to make a whole lot of money and to keep his costs down to as little as possible. Well, in that same vein, the owner, Jeffrey Loria, is suing season ticket holders for their unpaid bills. Fans of the team said that the team was not holding up their end of the bargain, including being guaranteed rights to free parking, special entrances, and special pre- and post-game buffets. That the team did not actually honor the use of free parking or the specific entrances or setting up these buffets for the fans who had season tickets. And given the fact that they were not actually going to honor that part of the deal, as well as the fact of the huge fire sale and the team being terrible, a number of season ticket holders have refused to pay the remaining parts of their bill, alleging that the Marlins did not follow their end of the bargain. Well, he's still going after people for this and has been going after people for the last few years now, but most notably this week, he is owed $97,000 by a season ticket holder named Kenneth Sack, but is trying to take ownership of a building worth $725,000 to collect rent until he gets exactly what he wants of this $97,000 that he claims he's owed. I'm not a person who dabbles in math all that often, but $97,000 is a fraction of $725,000. So why would you get to take temporary control of a building or take control of a building to get that money? And it's really, really interesting to me that this owner is apparently cool with getting out from under huge costs when the services isn't what he expected or he had been, quote unquote, promised when he signed all of those players to those massive contracts. And he was cool with having his massive fire sale and sending all those players away. He was cool with sending all of these players to different spots in different locations. He was somehow cool with that. But yet when fans decide they're not going to pay because they're not getting what they were promised, somehow that's bad and terrible and wrong, and Jeffrey Loria is going to sue them into oblivion over it. This is not the way that you build a fan base. This is a way that you become a greedhead owner. And we see that case in case in case again. You know, the wage theft issues, the getting the stadium with public funding while crying poor, and we know from the financials that were released, he wasn't nearly as poor as he was claiming to be to get the public to finance such a huge part of the stadium, to the point where he was investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission over it. That this is the problem when you have public funding of sports stadiums, that you give your money to owners like this. And when you see owners like Jeffrey Loria, when you see owners like the former LA Clippers owner Donald Sterling, when you see those kinds of owners, it just makes the case for public ownership being even stronger, that the idea of public ownership is even more strong and more of a vociferous argument to make, because we really can't be any worse. We really can't be any worse than those guys if the public decided to own some franchises. Well, we also have another owner who's attempting to get into worst owner in sports, and so we're going to jump over to NBA to talk about that. In NBA news, the owner of the Detroit Pistons, Tom Gores, is in the news because his venture company is set to purchase Securus Technologies. And Securus Technologies is the second largest prison and jail communications company in the United States. That Securus Technologies, which the owner of the Detroit Pistons is set to buy, is one of the largest jail and prison telecommunications companies in the United States. And there are a number of problems with Securus Technologies. Of course, they've moved into these unregulated aspects of GPS monitoring, parole supervision, probation coverage, commissary coverage, things that aren't really regulated by the government so they can get huge profits coming off of those things by gouging people. On the places that have been regulated, they've been fighting any kind of regulation. Any kind of regulation that might do something to inhibit their bottom line they have been fighting against, most notably being the cost of prison phone calls. That Securus Technologies currently charges over $1 a minute for prisoners to make phone calls, and that either comes out of the prisoner's commissary account or it comes out of the accounts of their loved ones who are paying these exorbitant prices. And part of the commission also goes back to a number of the jails, and so there is a very big incentive to jack the prices up. Most notably, in Michigan, for a 15-minute phone call, for 15 minutes of a phone call, Securus Technologies were charging prisoners over $22 for a 15-minute phone call with their loved ones. And we understand that people who are locked up, people who are incarcerated, people who are put in cages need that kind of connection with their loved ones, need that kind of connection with family. And this is where Securus Technologies has stepped in and is providing that service, but doing so at an exploitative rate, doing so at a horrific level of profiteering. And they've been fighting the Federal Communications Commission about any kind of regulation over how much they can charge for phone calls, because it's a huge profit cow. It's a huge cash cow for them, of the prison industrial complex, making them tons and tons of money. That the way that they're making money is from the prison industrial complex. And so they are set to potentially buy one of the largest prison and jail communications companies, the owner of the Detroit Pistons, who is noted for being a philanthropist, yet is going to get involved with this prison industrial complex profit-making venture. And we hope to have activist and author Brian Dolliner on a future broadcast to talk about this matter further, as he's been doing some investigation and writing into this topic about the Detroit Pistons owner getting involved with this development. And we are going to jump into our final segment of the show, one that is very heavy this week on this week's broadcast, and that is some other sports news. In other sports news, the Olympics are back in the news, and they are back in the news because the city of Rio de Janeiro and Rio organizers have asked the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, to help cover between $35 and $40 million of debt that the city has racked up. They want the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, to help cover the $35 to $40 million in debt. And of course, you can already guess, the IOC has said no. They're already off to Pyeongchang, South Korea, to profit. And by profit, that also includes, taking down old growth forests and making all sorts of money from that and other ventures. They're already off profiting from the next venture. And, we've talked to activists in Chicago. We've talked to activists in Los Angeles. We've talked to activists in London. We've talked to activists in Rio. We've talked to activists most recently as last week in Tokyo about why there is so much resistance to the Olympics. They have a long and storied and infamous track record of not caring about the impacts of what happens to these host cities, especially the host cities after they've left. These white elephant stadiums that are put in place and causing huge, massive problems, that the huge expenditures of public funds to this entity aren't beneficial in the long term. And we know from Rio, the current estimated cost is $13.1 billion. And at the time that they're facing a recession, that $13.1 billion just spent on the Olympics, and that's not even talking the World Cup costs, that money could have gone to help cover some of these issues in the recession. It could have helped cover some of those costs. And the IOC have already washed their hands on it. They are already moving to the next city to try to profiteer off the next city. And looks at where the games are going to go next, whether it's going to be LA or Paris for 2024 and 2028. That they're already thinking about the next cities where they can go to profit. They're already thinking of the next locations where they can go to make more money. And in thinking about the International Olympic Committee and this almost con artistry level of profiteering, it reminded me of a segment from one of my favorite television shows. I'm a big fan of The Simpsons, especially classic episodes of The Simpsons. And in thinking about the IOC, I don't think this is too much of a stretch to think of the International Olympic Committee a bit like Lyle Lanley from The Simpsons. Lyle Lanley was a character voiced by Phil Hartman, who was the con artist monorail salesman who showed up in Springfield when they found out they had $3 million to spend, and showed up and basically made the argument for a monorail, got them to give him massive amounts of money for the monorail, and then tried running out of town with all of that money, leaving them with a shoddy, subpar monorail system that was about to fall apart. And does that not sound like the International Olympic Committee? I mean, at least with Lyle Lanley, we got a musical song like Monorail, 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 Mono-Do. Like, at least we got that. I mean, can't you picture the International Olympic Committee? We brought the games to Sochi, Beijing, and London, and by gum, it put them on the map. Can't you see that happening with the IOC? Can't you see that being a thing that the IOC is going to do? I think this needs to be a recurring bit, that the IOC is Lyle Lanley from The Simpsons. That's basically what they're doing. This is siphoning huge amounts of public funds to their own private coffers, and then when these cities ask for any kind of assistance, they're being refused. Meanwhile, we have some international track and field news with the International Association of Athletics Federation talking about the quote-unquote problem of androgenism. That they're talking about the supposed problem of hyperandrogenism. And that is when women produce more testosterone than normal. In 2015, Indian runner Dutee Chand successfully challenged the International Association on Athletics Federation rules about hyperandrogenism. And those rules have been suspended. And the IAAF, the International Association of Athletics and Federation, has been given 2 years to prove that these rules are actually valid and should remain on the books. Well, there was a new study from the British Journal of Sports Medicine that got a lot of publicity, and there was massive sports articles talking about how this could impact certain athletes like Caster Semenya and Dutee Chand. Well, this report, this study that was done by the British Journal of Sports Medicine, was actually commissioned by the IAAF. And then the IAAF very loudly trumpeted its findings, talking about how there was a 1.8 to 4.5% performance advantage for women with higher levels of testosterone. And they plan to bring this data to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, the CAS, to get the rules brought back in place. That they put this out and then they trumpeted all over the media about how there's this performance advantage. It's 1.8 to 4.5%. And the layperson looking at this data is, oh man, that sounds unfair. Well, there's a number of problems with this study. Not only was it commissioned by the IAAF and then they tried to not keep their fingerprints on it at all, but they failed in that miserably. Lindsay Gibbs of Think Progress has a really fantastic article about the myriad problems with the study. And they noted that there is no real evidence here, that this study is not really evident of any kind of performance advantage. That she talked to a senior research scholar at the Center for Biomedical Ethics at Stanford University, Katrina Karkakis, and she said, quote, "This is exactly the evidence CAS rejected as being insufficient. This was the exact same kind of evidence that was already previously rejected as not being sufficient." This was already rejected, and yet this study is now being put in. Now, when you look at the methodology of the study, it lumped in known dopers into this data set. They tried lumping in people they knew to have cheated into this data set, and instead of using every single one of their times, they only used their best time. And even when they cherry-picked so much here of only using their best time, lumping in known dopers, they could only get to 1.8 to 4.5% of a performance advantage, which was already deemed by the Court of Arbitration in Sport to be, quote, insufficient, close quote. That they didn't show any kind of sufficiency, but it didn't stop them from trumpeting this out. And also, one of the interesting things that was in the kind of annals of this study, there was no correlation between testosterone and athleticism in men. That they could not find any correlation between testosterone and athleticism in men, which may just smash the entire theory on its face. Athletes consistently have natural advantages, whether it's tall basketball players or very tiny gymnasts. Yet only in this specific area are they trying to legitimize the idea that this is an unfair performance enhancer. Runners like Dutee Chand, Caster Semenya, other And other athletes who have hyperandrogenism are not cheating. It's something they naturally have, and they should not be penalized for it, especially so when there's no performance advantage coming from it. That the data set is not showing that there is a performance advantage coming from it. The data sets have shown that it's insufficient to make that claim. And yet, here the IAAF is trying to justify this kind of pushback against these athletes, refusing to let them participate, trying to make sure that they can't participate, putting them out there publicly for these kind of conversations about their gender identity and their sexual identity, and having these invasive kinds of tests to make sure that they're quote-unquote women. It's ridiculously terrible. And the data itself does not bear the point that there is any reason to have these rules on the books, no matter how much they want to try to get publicity in the public press on this issue. You're listening to Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports / sports media. We've just been discussing some terrible sports owners behaving badly, the Olympic scam, and possibly a recurring idea of calling the IOC the human manifestation of Lyle Lanley from The Simpsons, as well as Duty Chan and Caster Semenya being just allowed to race freely already without the stigmatization, without the pressure, and the IAAF trying to find and claw to any kind of ridiculous pseudoscience to back up bigoted claims. Coming up on Not Another Sports Show, we will be talking about some stadium shenanigans from around the sporting world, a brief look at the garbage fire that is Mayweather-McGregor, and we'll close out with some happy news because we can't talk about everything terrible. So let's continue our look at some other sports news. In other sports news, hockey is set to have a potential NHL work stoppage or lockout or strike coming up after the 2020 season. As NHL Players Association Executive Director Donald Fehr noted, quote, "Are the players taking precautions against potential collective bargaining agreement Armageddon? The current deal runs out in September 2022, but both sides have options in 2019 to end things in 2020. Signing bonuses are generally paid on July 1st, the first day of each new NHL calendar. My judgment is that players would be foolish not to take into consideration the possible outcomes when the contract expires or the other side terminates it early. They have to take that into account," close quote, which is why a number of players are taking larger signing bonuses and taking most of their salary in the shape of signing bonuses compared to any kind of salary, that they're taking most of it in the form of signing bonuses because there could be a major stoppage. And longtime listeners to this show and longtime sports fans may remember that in 2012, the owners had a lockout of the players to get more profits, not because they needed them, not because they were concerned about revenue, because they gained over $1 billion in revenue, but still demanded huge concessions from the players and huge concessions from the wages and salaries of these players, despite the fact that the league grew over $1 billion in value. They cried poor and locked them out to try to get extra concessions just because they could. In Arizona, the new owner and CEO of the NHL's Coyotes chose a less than stellar option for his analogy on building a new stadium. In the more innocuous statement, owner Andrew Barroway said, quote, "We're going to make it happen. I think we've put the people in place to get it done. I can tell you that we're aggressively pursuing all options and we have to make it work. We don't have a choice," close quote, in talking about the possibilities of a new stadium. Which then makes me wonder, great, are you going to use your own money then since it needs to get done and you don't have a choice? Are you going to privately finance this venture? Hopefully so. But CEO Steve Patterson said, quote, "Arena deals take time, talks, and negotiations. They're kind of like vampire movies. You go to the coffin a dozen times and you think they're dead, but they keep rising back up. Every single deal I've been involved with was thought to be dead a dozen times, and then it rose back up," close quote. Yeah, arena deals. They're like creatures of the night that siphon lifeblood from the living and who are deathly averse to any kind of sunlight. You know? That pretty aptly describes stadium deals. They're creatures of the night that siphon the tax money from the living, and they're deathly averse to any kind of sunlight and public accountability. I think that analogy works. I think that analogy, it kind of works to describe them. But it's not just public funding of stadiums that can be really, really tremendously bad. Even privately funded stadiums can be bad, especially when the rules that are put in place aren't enforced. And we can check out the Boston Garden for more details there. In 1993, the Boston Garden was built with some private funding from a number of banks. And part of the rules when it was built was that the garden had to host at least 3 charity events and be open for at least 3 charity events per year to benefit the state's Recreation Facilities Commission. That there needed to be open for 3 charity events per year to benefit the state Recreation Facilities Commission. Well, 3 teenagers wanted to find money to build a new $21.5 million full-size hockey rink at the Jackson Square Recreation Center, and they started doing some digging into where they could find the funds. And these 3 teenagers did a little digging and found that since 1993, there have been a grand total of 0 events that are charity events at the Garden. 0 events to benefit the State Recreation Facilities Commission have happened since the stadium was agreed to be built in 1993. And now there's a big conversation with lawmakers and a whole bunch of major power players of how they're going to solve this issue of the fact that for the last 20 plus years, no one's been following that law. And is this going to be just a one-time payout, which the teens are hoping could get them the funding for the ice rink that they want? But this is also, looking at this idea that these kinds of rules on the books, they need to be enforced, and it can't just be teenagers who are finding these things and pushing this kind of enforcement. That the people who make these decisions and put these rules in place should actively be vigilant to make sure that the interests of the public are being watched out for and being enforced. And of course, we can't get away from this story without quoting Scooby-Doo, and they would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for those meddling kids. Meanwhile, Cincinnati, already on the hook for 2 of the worst stadium deals in history, has billionaire owners of a soccer team trying to get into Major League Soccer wanting $100 million in public money for a brand new publicly funded soccer stadium. They're asking for the $100 million to be spent because soccer fans would use restrooms and the concession stands, the food concourses, and the other amenities differently compared to a NFL game or a baseball game. That during a football game, during timeouts, during television timeouts, those sorts of things, you can get up and you can go to the restroom, you can go get food, you can go, that there's more time to do those things comparatively to a soccer game where you typically have to go at like halftime because you don't necessarily want to miss what could possibly be the only goal to take place during the actual game. So it's certainly different, but it hasn't stopped people from going to the current stadium that they play in, which is Nippert Stadium. Nippert Stadium is also where college football is played, and it hasn't stopped people from going. It hasn't stopped anybody from going, given the fact that the bathroom structures are the way they are. It hasn't stopped anybody from going, and they're near the top in the amount of people currently going to games. When you look at attendance rates, they're currently at the top. It hasn't stopped anybody from going. There haven't been major complaints. And we can get toilets and fix the toilet structures for less than $100 million. Yet this becomes the latest gambit to try to get public funding for a brand new stadium. Unless you've been living under a rock this past week, you may have noticed that the promotions for the August 25th Floyd Mayweather-Conor McGregor boxing match have been ongoing. And this is not so much of a fight, because it's a tried and true expert at actual boxing taking on a person who is not a professional boxer. So there isn't really much of a fight here to be promoted. But they are going with the tried and true method of promotion of boxing, something that's been on the label for over 100 years, and that's race baiting. And it's the real ridiculous race baiting, the kind of quasi-new great white hope of Conor McGregor to beat Floyd Mayweather. And some in the media have called this a clown show. And I kind of disagree, because clowns are funny. Like, this is more just the train wreck nexus of racism, sexism, misogyny, and the, like, faux edginess to titillate fans into paying money. The saying whatever they need to try to say to be so ridiculously over the top to get fans to want to see this fight, because there is no real fight here to actually promote. There's no, like, smart money says Floyd Mayweather is going to win. Like, there's that is not really in doubt. So they have to go with this nexus of racist, misogynist, sexist, faux edginess to try to push this fight. And of course, Floyd Mayweather has a long-standing terrible history. And trigger warning, we are going to be talking about domestic violence here. There's multiple allegations of domestic violence. He pled guilty to it twice. In a third case, he was convicted. It was vacated. He spent time in jail for it, allegedly assaulting the mother of his child on a number of different occasions, assaulting friends of the mother because he didn't approve of them. Just a huge host of instances of it. Threatened the kids if they were going to call 911. He's had really controlling ideas about women. You know, he is calling his new gentleman's club Girl Collection, and has said, quote, when it comes to females, even though you can't drive 10 cars at one time, but you got people that got 10 cars, so you're able to keep maintenance up on 10 cars. So I feel that as far as when it comes to females, that same thing should apply. If you're able to take care of 20, then you should have 20, close quote. Women are not vehicles, Floyd. He also denies any kind of issues with his history of domestic violence because there's no pictures of it happening. That there's no pictures, and somehow pictures are the only thing that validates it compared to the people who said any of it. And he said, even if I did do it, only God can judge me. We should also remember in 2015 that the Mayweather camp pulled credentials of a number of journalists who reported on his history of domestic violence, including Rachel Nichols and Michelle Beadle of ESPN and HBO Boxing with Michelle Beadle, for talking about his history of domestic violence. They also refused credentials to Gawker's Hamilton Nolan and boxing writer Steve Kim for talking about his history of domestic violence. And, of course, most recently in the news has been Mayweather owing some back taxes from 2015, and his camp saying that he does not have the liquid funds on hand to pay that, and so he's asking the IRS to wait and take the money from the McGregor payday. And at a most recent presser, he used a bunch of misogynist terms. He also used an anti-gay slur talking about Conor McGregor. Meanwhile, McGregor has his own history of race baiting. That in 2015, during a fight against Brazilian Jose Aldo, said, quote, if this were a different time, I would invade his favela and kill anyone that was not fit to work, close quote. He also said about Nate Diaz that he was, quote, like a cholo gangster from the hood. He makes gun signs with the right hand and animal balloons with the left hand, close quote. And, of course, the racist iconography during these pressers by telling Floyd Mayweather Jr. to, quote, dance for him, boy. Oh, and then even, like, he got told, like, yeah, that's not an okay thing to do. He, of course, doubled down on it and did it again. and then said that he can't be racist because he is, quote, half black from the belly button down, and then gyrated. During a spot for Jimmy Kimmel, he talked about the movie Rocky III, a film where Mr. T is the main villain, Clubber Lang, that was the movie, quote, with dancing monkeys in the gym, close quote. This is the nexus of everything terrible, of racist, sexist, misogynist, faux edginess to try to get as many people to pay attention to them. And I certainly could take the idea of the Paul Anka strategy from The Simpsons of just don't look, just don't look. But at a certain point, you kind of have to push back against the race baiting here, the really lazy idea that they're going to push in making this case. And really, when it comes to August 26th, just don't look. Like, that $99 for the fight could be spent so many other places and so much better, in community services, rather than watching a really terrible fight take place with two people that I'd rather not see either one of them win. But we're going to close out with a little bit of happy news on this broadcast, and that is involving the nation of Iran. One of the top Iranian soccer players in the country, Ali Karimi, and the captain of the Iranian national soccer team, Masoud Shojeh, have called for an end to the ban on women attending major men's sporting events. Shojeh said, quote, "I think it is the dream of many Iranian women who are football fans. I think we could build to have a stadium that could hold 200,000 spectators because we see the flood of passion from our ladies. I hope it happens very, very soon." Top soccer player Ali Karimi said, quote, "This is the demand of millions upon millions of female fans who like to watch football matches and other events up close. This important issue is not impossible. This dream of female sports fans can be achieved through correct planning," close quote. And they've not only made these public statements, they've not only put these public pronouncements out there talking about how they are supportive of women getting access to the sporting world, they've also mentioned it to the president, that in the middle of June, they had a meeting with the President Rouhani, after they were celebrating the fact that Iran had made it to the 2018 World Cup. And during that meeting, they brought up this idea of lifting the ban on women being allowed to go to the sports stadiums. And so this is huge solidarity from male activists to use their prominent platforms to speak out in favor and in support of their female counterparts and in for female sports fans in Iran. So some really awesome news to see there, and hopefully they can lift that ban very, very fast so women sports fans can attend the games that they would like to attend. This has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports media, a weekly news hour highlighting the intersections overlapping the world of sports, activism, and radical politics. We are available for broadcast by Pacifica Radio member network stations, college and community radio stations, and low-power FM stations, as the number already are. If you can't listen live or you happen to miss any of today's broadcast, we are also available via audio podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and through the Google Play Store. NotAnotherSportsShow.podbean.com, and video editions at tinyurl.com/NASRadioVideo. To contact the show, it is at NAS Radio Sports on Twitter and Instagram, Not Another Sports Show on Facebook, or the NAS Radio hashtag. For all of us here at the show, this has been Not Another Sports Show, a radical look at the world of sports, left sports radio, and we will be back with you next week.